Hello there everyone, my name is David Luchford and welcome to lesson 23 of my Ancient Greek course. Lesson 23 is titled The Third Declension Part 2 and you can see that I've put 3 C nouns and 3 D nouns in brackets. That's because today we are going to be focusing on those subgroups of the third declension. Last time we looked at 3A nouns and 3B nouns and we've done some practice with those, but now we are going on to 3C nouns and 3D nouns. But before we do that, why don't we take a look at my virtual set of shelves? Or should I say sets of shelves? Because since the last lesson, Adrian bought me 7 virtual amphorae. And you can see that there were only about 3 spaces left on the original set of shelves. And I wanted to keep all of Adrian's amphorae together, so I had to obtain a new virtual set of shelves, which Adrian has filled up with his amphorae. So Adrian, thank you very much for the 7 virtual amphorae. It is very generous of you, and I greatly appreciate the support. So Adrian, you are amazing, and thank you for the astonishing amount of amphorae. And I would like to say thank you to all of my historic supporters also. But wait, we're not done yet, because if I go on to the next slide, we shall see that Mike bought me 33 virtual amphorae. 33! I could hardly find a piece of furniture big enough to accommodate the 33, and even then, I tried to make them symmetrical, but I couldn't divide up 33 evenly with the shelf space that I had. So you can see that I've had to place one amphora on its own to the right, which is also Mike's, okay? That's included in Mike's collection. Mike, you are magnificent. Thank you very much for the unbelievable number of amphorae. And I should say that Mike actually donated 5 before, but then he's gone on to donate another 33. So Mike, you certainly have the record for the greatest number of amphorae purchased. And you too will always have your own unit, this massive unit. I think you could call it an absolute unit of a set of shelves at the start of my lessons. Thank you very much once again for your support, Mike. I greatly appreciate it. Now, if you also would like to support the channel, you can do so by going to www.buymeacoffee.com/learnancientgreek. The link is in the description below and in the info box in the corner of the video. But if you do buy me an amphora or amphorae, I'm currently unsure of what type of furniture or what type of set of shelves it will be on, okay, because I'm out of space. I know I have a gap down here still from the initial set of shelves, but I'm not going to fill it with amphorae because I would like to recognise the order in which people have supported my channel. And so I need to find something else to fill this gap with, okay? So I'm going to be posting a poll, I think, to get the popular opinion on what I should fill this gap with, whether it's a plant, and if so, what type of plant, or a bust, or something else. Anyway, having looked at my now 3 sets of shelves, plus 1 individual shelf, let us now go on to the third declension. And in particular, as I said, we're going to be learning about the subgroups 3C and 3D. As I've said before, I got the labels for these subgroups from Jack's amazing Reading Greek course, which is the course that I primarily used to learn Greek. And as I just said, today we're looking at the subgroups 3C and 3D. And we're going to start by talking about how to recognise that a noun belongs to one of these subgroups. So, how do we recognise that a noun is a 3C noun? Well, 3C nouns have a nominative singular which ends in os, a genitive singular which ends in ous, and they are all neuter. And with 3C nouns, what lets us know that a noun is a 3C noun is the fact that its nominative singular ends in os and its genitive singular ends in ous. So as usual, it's these 2 forms that let us know it belongs to the subgroup 3C. We said that 3A nouns and 3B nouns were exceptions in that it's actually the second and third bits of information which let us know that a noun is a 3A noun or a 3B noun, namely the genitive singular ending and the gender. But usually it's the nominative singular ending and the genitive singular ending, which let us know a noun subgroup. And that's what it is with 3C nouns. If a noun ends in os in the nominative singular and us in the genitive singular, then it's a 3C noun, and it will be neuter. Be careful not to confuse 3C nouns with 2A nouns, since 2A nouns also end in os in the nominative singular, but they end in u in the genitive singular rather than us. And also 2A nouns are masculine or feminine or common gender, while 3C nouns are all neuter. What about 3D nouns? Well, 3D nouns end in es or class in the nominative singular. They end in us in the genitive singular, and they are masculine or feminine. Now, there are actually two types of 3D noun. The first type ends in es in the nominative singular, the second type ends in class in the nominative singular, and they do decline a bit differently depending on which of these types they are. But anyway, we would recognise that a noun is a 3D noun from the fact that its nominative singular ends in es or class, and its genitive singular ends in us. So these two bits of information, as usual, let us know the subgroup. And I've put that they're masculine or feminine. They are typically masculine, but there are some feminine ones as well. Now be careful not to confuse 3D nouns, which end in es or class in the nominative singular, with 1D nouns, because 1D nouns, like nauters, that is to say 1D nouns of the first kind, also end in es in the nominative singular. But 1D nouns have a genitive singular that ends in u, while 3D nouns have a genitive singular which ends in us. Now, one final thing to note is that these endings that I've given you here are the endings for Attic Greek. For reasons that I shall explain later on, the genitive singular of these nouns could also be seen as ending in eos. So do be aware that if you're looking at a dialect of Greek other than Attic Greek, such as Ionic Greek, for example, you might see these genitive singular endings as eos instead of us. I'm now going to show how we would recognise that a noun is a 3C noun or a 3D noun from its dictionary form. Here is the noun xipos. Xipos means sword. We can see that it ends in os in the nominative singular and us in the genitive singular, and that it is neuter. However, the crucial thing in terms of recognising its subgroup is these two bits of information here. The fact that it ends in os in the nominative singular and us in the genitive singular lets us know that it is a 3C noun. And so it will decline like all 3C nouns do. Let's now look at a second example. Here is the noun teichos, which means wall. Teichos ends in os in the nominative singular and us in the genitive singular, and therefore it must be a 3C noun. And like all 3C nouns, it is neuter, as we can see from the definite article to. Let's look at some examples of 3D nouns in their dictionary form. Here is the noun trieres, which means trireme. A trireme was an ancient Greek ship with 3 rows of oars. You can see that the tri part relates to 3. Anyway, trieres means trireme, and we can see that its nominative singular ends in es, its genitive singular ends in us, and it is feminine. The fact that it ends in es in the nominative singular and us in the genitive singular means that it is a 3D noun. And in particular, it means that it's a 3D noun of the first kind, the kind that ends in es in the nominative singular instead of class. And this is one of the few 3D nouns that is feminine, as we can see from the definite article hair. Let's look at a second example. Here is the noun Socrates. We can see that it's a proper name from the fact that it's got a capital sigma at the start, and it means Socrates. Now, we can see that Socrates ends in es in the nominative singular and us in the genitive singular, and therefore it must be a 3D noun of the first kind, and so it would decline like all other 3D nouns of the first kind. We can also see that it's masculine, as most 3D nouns are, and in fact, I'll mention this again later, but most 3D nouns are men's names and they're also masculine. Most 3D nouns, and we see that here with Socrates' name. Let's look at an example of a 3D noun of the second kind. Here we have the noun Heracles. Now we can see that it's got a capital eta at the start, so we know that it must be a proper name, and it is in fact the name Heracles. Heracles is the name of the legendary Greek figure whom the Romans called Hercules, but the Greeks called him Heracles, or more accurately, Heracles. Now, his name ends in class in the nominative singular and us in the genitive singular, and therefore it must be a 3D noun of the second kind, and we can see that his name is also masculine. Because it's a 3D noun of the second kind, it would decline like all other 3D nouns of the second kind. And do bear in mind that proper names like Heracles and Socrates would of course only have a declension in the singular, because there's only one Socrates and there's only one Heracles. However, we shall see that trireme, trieres, does have a plural declension, because there can be multiple triremes. And finally, we can see that Heracles fits into that pattern I told you about, of 3D nouns typically being masculine and men's names. Now, when I mention that pattern, please don't get the impression that all men's names are 3D nouns, because that's not the case. Although many 3D nouns are men's names, not all men's names are 3D nouns. In fact, we've already met Plato's name, Platon, which is a 3A noun. There are other men's names that are 3A nouns, and in addition, there are men's names that are 2A nouns, and there are also men's names that are 1D nouns, of both kinds. So please do bear in mind that men's names don't just belong to one subgroup. But nonetheless, it is useful to know that many 3D nouns are men's names. However, as we've seen, what matters in terms of identifying a noun as a 3D noun is its nominative singular ending and its genitive singular ending, and the same applies to 3C nouns. Anyway, overall, that's how we would recognise that a noun is a 3C noun or a 3D noun, and which type of 3D noun if so, based on its dictionary form. Let's now look at 3C nouns in more depth, including how they decline. As I've already said, 3C nouns are all neuter. They end in os in the nominative singular and us in the genitive singular, as we know. Examples include xipos and teichos. And we shall meet more examples in the next lesson, where we shall do practice with what we've learned in this lesson about the third declension. But for now, we know that xipos and teichos are 3C nouns. And we're going to use xipos, meaning sword, as our paradigm. Here is the declension of the noun xipos. We can see that it declines as follows. Xipos, xipos, xipus, xipei, xiper, xiper, xipon, xipesin. Now, the endings in bold will be the endings for 3C nouns in Attic Greek. So if you're only going to be reading Attic Greek, you can just learn those endings. But in a moment, I shall explain why these endings are different to the sets of endings for third declension nouns that I taught you in the first lesson on the third declension. And that will also reveal how this noun might look in other dialects of Greek. Plus, it will also be useful in terms of remembering this declension. But for now, let me just point out that we have identical forms in the nominative and the accusative because 3C nouns are neuter. And we know that neuter words in Greek are visually identical in the nominative and the accusative. That always applies if a word is neuter. The nominative and the accusative will be visually identical. We would tell from the context whether it's nominative or accusative. And the next thing to note is that 3C nouns do have a regular ending in the nominative singular. The unique form will end in os, like in xipos and teikos. They end in os. They've got a regular ending, which is nice. In contrast to 3A nouns, which have various endings in the nominative singular. But you might be asking right now, well, how is this a third declension noun? You might be saying that this looks like it just uses the stem xip and adds the endings os, us, etc. to that stem. Except in the dative plural where you have epsilon, which gives you a clue that something else is going on here. And I'm going to reveal what that is now. But let me just emphasise that if you're only reading Attic Greek, you can essentially just learn these endings, and you can learn that the ending is esin rather than just sin. And you could essentially treat xip as being the stem, if you just wanted to read Attic Greek. But the truth is, this noun does have an oblique stem. Now, I'm not going to overcomplicate things here by going into the original oblique stem of this noun, but let me just say that the oblique stem ultimately is xiphe. Ultimately, 3C nouns have an oblique stem that ends in epsilon. So they have a regular oblique stem. Their oblique stem does not need learning individually. It will always be the nominative singular form minus the os and then just plus epsilon. That will be the oblique stem of a 3C noun. Ultimately, that's what the oblique stem will be. I say ultimately because it looks a bit different before some changes take place, but ultimately it's xiphe. So what you have in the genitive and dative singular and the nominative, accusative, genitive and dative plural is the oblique stem xiphe plus the set of endings for neuter third declension nouns that I taught you in the first lesson on the third declension. And in Attic Greek, that set of endings contracts with the epsilon at the end of the oblique stem to give us these endings that we see here. Us, a, orn. However, the ending sin in the dative plural does not contract with the epsilon at the end of the oblique stem because it begins in a consonant. So there we can actually see the oblique stem xiphe with the ending sin added onto it. But in the genitive singular, dative singular, and nominative, accusative, and genitive plural, contractions have taken place. That's why they're different to the regular neuter third declension endings, because they've contracted with the epsilon at the end of the oblique stem. So to show you, the genitive singular form, xipus, is actually the oblique stem xiphe plus the ending os, which we learned in the first lesson as the regular genitive singular ending for neuter third declension nouns. It's also the regular genitive singular ending for masculine and feminine third declension nouns, but because 3C nouns are neuter, the set that we're adding to the oblique stem here is the neuter set. The dative singular form, xiphe, is actually the oblique stem xiphe plus the ending iota. The nominative plural form, xipher, is actually the oblique stem xiphe plus the ending alpha. And it's the same in the accusative plural form. Xipher there is xiphe plus alpha. The genitive plural form, xiphorn, is actually xiphe plus orn. And finally, the dative plural form is xiphe plus sin. And that is why you have that in the dative plural form, because there the epsilon, the e at the end of the oblique stem, has not contracted with the ending, because the ending sin begins in a consonant, and so no contraction has taken place. So you do get to see the oblique stem in the dative plural form, but everywhere else in Attic Greek, it has contracted with the endings. But in other dialects of Greek, such as Ionic Greek, words are often left uncontracted. And so in Ionic Greek, this noun in the genitive singular would not be xipous, but rather xipeos. It would just be the oblique stem plus os, and the contraction would not have occurred. So that brings me back to what I said earlier. The reason why you might see the genitive singular of 3C nouns and 3D nouns as eos, depending on the dialect, is because that contraction may not have taken place. But in Attic Greek, the contraction will have taken place, and so you will see the genitive singular as ending in ous. Anyway, I hope that explanation has been very useful. And the final thing I'll say is you can see that we haven't got a distinct vocative singular form listed here, so therefore we know the vocative singular is going to be identical to the nominative singular. So if you wanted to address your sword, you would just call it xipos. You wouldn't call it anything different from the nominative singular form. And we know that the vocative plural is always identical visually to the nominative plural. Anyway, with all of that said, please do pause the video and note down this declension with the extra information. Okay, in a moment we're going to look at 3D nouns in more depth, but one last thing is, I should say that in my videos, for now, 3C nouns will be in their contracted form, because we're learning Attic Greek in these videos currently. So you can expect to see 3C nouns in their contracted forms. Let's now look at 3D nouns in more depth. 3D nouns, as I've said, are masculine or feminine. However, they are typically masculine and men's names. As I've said, there are two types of 3D noun, those that end in ers, us, and those that end in clares, us. We know that the first ending listed is the nominative singular ending, the second one is the genitive singular ending. Examples include, as we've seen, trieres, which means trireme. That's a 3D noun of the first kind. Socrates, meaning Socrates, which is a 3D noun of the first kind as well. And Herakles, meaning Heracles. That is a 3D noun of the second kind. We know that because of the clares nominative singular ending. Let's now look at how 3D nouns of the first kind decline. And let's do that by using trieres as a paradigm. So we can see that trieres declines as follows. Trieres, triere, trierus, triere, trieres, 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 trieron, trieresin. If you're just learning Attic Greek, you can learn this paradigm, and these will be the endings for 3D nouns of the first kind. And it looks like they just have one stem with a set of endings added onto it, except in the dative plural where you have that epsilon before the ending sin. Now you might be able to guess from that that in reality they don't just have one stem, but rather they do have an oblique stem, and like 3C nouns, all 3D nouns of the first kind have an oblique stem that ends in epsilon ultimately. So there is a consistent way of forming the nominative singular and the oblique stem for 3D nouns of the first kind, which is very helpful. The nominative singular will end in ers, and I should say that the vocative singular is a shortened version of the nominative singular, as it often is with third declension nouns,
at least those that are masculine or feminine.
and it ends in s. Instead of ers, we've got s in the vocative singular. Now, in all of the other forms, except for the accusative plural that we'll talk about in a moment, in all of the forms except the accusative plural and except the nominative and vocative singular, so that is to say, in the accusative singular, the genitive singular, dative singular, nominative plural, genitive plural, and dative plural, we have the oblique stem triere plus the endings that are usually used for masculine and feminine third declension nouns, which I taught you in the first lesson on the third declension. So, the accusative singular form, triere, is actually triere plus a. The genitive singular form, trierus, is actually triere plus os. The dative singular form, triere, is actually triere plus I. The nominative plural form, trieres, is actually triere plus s. The accusative plural form is an exception. 3D nouns of the first kind borrow their accusative plural from the nominative plural. They just use the same form in the accusative plural as they do in the nominative plural, which is strange. It is a peculiar thing, but it's recognised that the accusative plural form is simply a borrowing of the nominative plural form. So strangely, although these nouns are either masculine or feminine, trieres is feminine, the nominative and the accusative plural are visually identical. So we do need to look out for that and tell which it is from the context when we're reading Greek. However, the genitive plural form is in reality triere plus on. The dative plural form is triere plus sin, and we actually see that in the dative plural because no contraction has taken place, since the ending begins in a consonant rather than a vowel. Now be aware, as with 3C nouns, in other dialects of Greek, you may see these words in their uncontracted form. So for instance, you might see the genitive singular form triereos rather than trierus. But in my videos, they will be in their contracted form unless I say otherwise. Please now pause the video and note down the declension of trieres along with the extra information on the screen. To show you a second paradigm, here is the name Socrates, which is a 3D noun of the first kind as well. We can see that it only exists in the singular, since there's only one Socrates, and that it declines just like trieres. It goes Socrates, Socrater, Socratus, Socrate, and then in the vocative, Socrates, because the vocative singular is a shortened version of the nominative singular. But just as with trieres in the other forms, we actually have an oblique stem that ultimately ends in epsilon, so with Socrates' name it is Socrate, and that has contracted with the standard set of endings for masculine and feminine third declension nouns. So, Socrater is actually Socrate plus a, Socratus is actually Socrate plus os, and Socrate is actually Socrate plus iota. Now I would encourage you to pause the video and note this one down as well. Although it declines just like trieres, it's good to learn it because it does help you to keep in mind that 3D nouns are typically men's names. So typically they will just exist in the singular. So please do pause the video and note this one down as well, with the other information on the screen too. Now 3D nouns of the second kind decline a bit differently to 3D nouns of the first kind, so we do need to learn another paradigm for those. And they are men's names, and so they exist in the singular only. And you can see that the paradigm we're using is Herakles, which means Heracles, as we know. We can see that his name declines as follows: Herakles, Heraklea, Herakleus, Herakle, Herakles. So these endings do differ from the singular endings for 3D nouns of the first kind, like Trieres and Socrates. So we do need to learn these separately, and we do also need to note that before some of these endings, we actually have epsilon. So before the ending alpha, we do have epsilon, and that does come from the oblique stem. Likewise, we've got it in the genitive singular as well, before ous. Now, if we're only wanting to read Attic Greek, we can just learn this paradigm and we shall be fine, but I'm going to explain why these endings are the way they are, which should help you to remember the Attic Greek declension, and it'll also prepare you to see the noun in other dialects, or 3D nouns of this kind in other dialects. So firstly, let me just say that the vocative singular is not actually a shortened version of the nominative singular here, but instead of using eta, it uses the diphthong a. Okay, so we can remember that individually because we know that the vocative singular is based on the nominative singular form for third declension nouns, in that it's either a modification of the nominative singular or the same as the nominative singular. Here it's a modified version. It's replaced the long vowel eta with the diphthong a. So instead of Herakles, we have Herakles. Now in these other forms, we have the oblique stem being used. Ultimately, the oblique stem is Heraklee with 2 epsilons at the end. Ultimately, okay? I know it's more nuanced than this in terms of the history of the oblique stem, but when it meets the endings, we can think of it as ultimately being Heraklee. So to be clear, we get the oblique stem of a 3D noun of the second kind by taking the nominative singular form of that noun, dropping the ending es, and then adding instead. So, Heraklea is actually Heraklee plus alpha. Now you might think, shouldn't it therefore be Heraklee? Given that I taught in my lesson on contract verbs that epsilon plus alpha makes eta. You would be right to think that. However, the legendary linguist Herbert Weir Smythe, in his Greek grammar, in chapter 56 on irregularities, tells us that in the third declension, a makes a. So this is an irregularity that we just need to be aware of. So, although there should be eta here, we have a long alpha instead. Heraklee plus alpha has become Heraklea. And now you know why that epsilon is before a couple of these endings, because there are 2 epsilons in the oblique stem, and the last one contracts with the ending, but the first one remains there in these 2 forms. So Herakleus is technically Heraklee plus os. The last epsilon contracts with os to make us, and so we get Herakleus in Attic Greek. Heraklee is Heraklee plus iota in reality. Now you might think, why is it not Heraklee, like we have epsilon before the ending in these 2 forms? And that I do not have the answer to, okay? If you know why this is Heraklee, why the first epsilon has contracted with the ending a that's been produced as a result of the contraction of the second epsilon with iota, why there has been a second contraction after that with the remaining epsilon and a, when there isn't a contraction with the remaining epsilon and us, for example, when epsilon and u can contract to make u, but they don't here. However, there could have been a second contraction. Epsilon and u do contract to make u, but there hasn't been. However, here we have had a second contraction. The first epsilon has contracted with the diphthong a to make a. So, I would be interested to know why that has occurred in the dative singular when it doesn't occur in the accusative singular or genitive singular. If you know, post it in the comments below. But I myself do not know, and I have looked into it. I've even been looking at books from the 1850s, okay? And I couldn't seem to get a clear answer as to why, in this particular declension, we have a rather than e, when we have eus rather than just us. It seems inconsistent that a second contraction has taken place here, but not here. Anyway, we just need to learn that it's got a in the dative singular, okay, rather than e. And that's everything for 3D nouns of the second kind. So please do pause the video and note down this paradigm with the extra information on the screen. And with that done, we are at the end of our lesson, so let's now summarise our learning for lesson 23. In this lesson, we learned how to recognise that a noun is a 3C noun or a 3D noun. In addition, we learned how 3C nouns and 3D nouns decline. And we also met 5 new nouns. I've put Heracles at the bottom of the list because it's a 3D noun of the second kind. So it's kind of in a different subgroup to Socrates and Trieres. I should have done that before with 1D nouns, which also have 2 kinds. There I put the list in a mixed way. I included all 1D nouns together, but I should have separated them out into their 2 kinds in the list. But no matter, can't change it now. But anyway, it is useful to note that both 1D nouns in the first declension and 3D nouns in the third declension come in 2 varieties. There's 2 kinds of 1D noun and there's 2 kinds of 3D noun. With that said, I must now say thank you very much for watching the video. I hope that you found it very useful, and thank you for all of your support. Thank you for all of your likes. Please like the video, by the way, if you enjoyed it. Thank you for all of your comments, and thank you very much for all of your support on Buy Me a Coffee. Please remember you can go to www.buymeacoffee.com/learn ancient Greek if you would like to support me financially. And if you would like to see a virtual amphora with your name above it, or multiple amphorae in my future lessons. For now though, I must say thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you again next time for some practice with what we've learned about the third declension today. Goodbye for now.